everyone, and welcome to Basic E-Tax Training. We're going to look at finishing a return and M1PR today. My name is Sarah. I'm the Volunteer Resources Manager here at Prepare and Prosper, and I am going to hand it off to Mike, who will be your instructor today. Take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I am Mike, and I am one of the many tax site managers. If you end up volunteering at VITA, the site in Bloomington, you'll work with me as well as a few other tax site managers. But no matter where you end up volunteering, you'll have great tax site managers working with you. So tonight we are talking about, as Sarah mentioned, finishing a tax return and M1PR. You are currently in Basic E training, also called Session E, finishing a return and M1PR. So you've already done Basic A, B, C, and D, hopefully. If not, there are recordings online, or you can talk to volunteer resources about the best approach. After this, you should attend the practice lab where you can practice doing some tax returns in TaxSlayer before you take the certification tests. So tonight we are going to talk about finishing a return, amendments and prior year tax returns, M1PR, which is the property tax refund for homeowners in Minnesota, and the IRS certification tests. Reminder that all the training materials that you've seen are available on the training site. If you go to Prepare and Prosper's website, start at Prepare and Prosper homepage, click Training Site, click Basic Tax Training, find the Volunteer Tax Manual. You can log into the TaxSlayer Practice Lab. You can link to the practice customer documents, like Tina Parker's documents that we've been looking at over these training sessions. You can see all the slides from the trainings, including today's training. You just need to scroll down on this page a little farther. And soon recordings of these trainings in case you want to revisit any of these topics. So we are going to talk about finishing a return. What to do when returns cannot be finished. Ideally, we'll be able to finish every customer's tax return and every shift, but that doesn't always happen for various reasons. Sometimes we get behind schedule, like if we're short-staffed or tax returns are more complex than normal and slows us down. Or sometimes customers are missing some documentation that they need, like a Form W-2 or other tax forms or information. So sometimes customers will not have everything they need and they need to leave the tax site and return. So whenever this happens, every single time that you have a customer who's missing any document that's needed to complete the tax return, please, 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 please talk to your tax site manager to determine what the best approach is. Sometimes the tax site manager will instruct the customer to go home, find the document, and return in the same shift. But that doesn't always work out. For example, let's say the customer says, I live 10 minutes away, and that might be true, but then it takes them 45 minutes to find the document that they're looking for. And by the time we return, we've had to move on to other customers, and then we're not able to finish the tax return anyway. It's definitely best practice to talk to the tax site manager and let the tax site manager make the call on the best way to handle that situation. So check with the manager when this happens. Sometimes we can enter the information that they have and finish the rest when they return. Sometimes it's best not to start a tax return in TaxSlayer at all and wait for them to return to even start the process. It depends on what exactly is the reason. You can use the tax return next steps document to fully communicate what the customer needs to do before returning to the site. There's a question, how much time is estimated per customer for an appointment? Well, we tell the customer that it can take 2 to 4 hours for the entire process from the time that they arrive at the tax site. I've seen it go as fast as 45 minutes, for example, if they're one of the first customers in and they have a very simple tax return. And I've seen it take, I don't know if I've ever had one tax return take 4 hours, but sometimes we have customers with more than 1 year of tax returns to do, in which case it can easily take more than 4 hours and they need to come to multiple shifts to have everything done. So we usually estimate that on average, each tax preparer will get through 3 or maybe 4 tax returns in a shift, but there's so much variability depending on each customer's tax situation. This is the tax return next steps. This is a new document for this upcoming tax season. We haven't had this in the past. And we use this when a tax return cannot be finished. You'll see it has the customer's name, the tax year, today's date, the site location, and instructions here. In order to complete and file your tax return, you'll need to schedule an appointment. So we have different options here, like schedule a new appointment online or by calling, contact the self-employment tax service at Prepare and Prosper to make an appointment. That's if they have more than about $10,000 worth of self-employment income. The nice thing is if you certify, well, I shouldn't say nice thing, but if you certify basic, you don't have to deal with self-employment income at all. If you certify advanced, you do. ITIN appointments might need to be scheduled. We do have a date, a box here for either to write the date and time and location of the next appointment, or a date and time to go online or call to make another appointment, because sometimes our schedules are full. And instructions on what to bring, which documents to bring. I imagine that there are more options in this. This is just part of the form. I haven't seen the full form yet. Viewing and printing the return. Okay. As you've known or have seen in previous trainings, you can always follow along in your volunteer manual. This top right corner tells us which page of the volunteer manual we're on. So when you're ready to preview the tax return after you've done all your data entry, you can go to the summary/print section. Then click print the return to a PDF, and you can look over the PDF to check your work. As you probably remember in Basic D, the last one, we looked at this PDF version of the hypothetical customer Tina Parker's tax return. Validation errors. So TaxSlayer automatically checks a few things while completing a return, but it doesn't know everything about the customer. It can only screen for things that are obviously either wrong or maybe wrong, and it's advising you to take a second look. So most validation errors must be resolved before a form can be saved. Note that it says most because, like I said, TaxSlayer doesn't know everything about the customer. And so a validation error might not be an error depending on the customer's specific situation. Some validation errors, such as a missing form, will appear after the summary screen. You should resolve the errors before sending the tax return to review, either by fixing an error if it is an error, or maybe by making a note in the intake paperwork if it's not an error because of an unusual or unique situation about that tax return. Of course, if you have trouble resolving and you're not sure how to resolve it and you can't find instructions in your documentation, you can always ask for help from a tax site manager or another volunteer. Here are some sample validation errors. Errors in red must be corrected. So these are examples of errors that must be addressed. We wouldn't have a situation where we leave a red error in place. In this example, our records indicate the health insurance section is incomplete. Select Visit to correct this information. Then if you click on the Visit button, it brings you to the health insurance section of the federal tax return, where you'll answer either yes, the customer had ACA insurance, meaning they purchased a health plan through the MNPR marketplace, or no, they did not. Warnings concerning your, review yellow warnings. If it's accurate for the return situation, move on. So this is an example of a validation error that we might leave in place depending on the taxpayer's situation. Here's an example of one. You indicated that you paid taxes to Minnesota on your W-2, but you are not filing a Minnesota state return. To add a state return, select the button below and follow the instructions to add your state return. So this is an example where the Form W-2 from an employer shows that taxes were withheld for Minnesota, but there's no Minnesota tax return prepared. In almost every case, you're going to want to prepare a Minnesota tax return, because even if they don't have like a tax liability or filing requirement in Minnesota, then they can get whatever Minnesota income tax was withheld refunded in that example. State validation errors. This can be a little counterintuitive sometimes. It's important to correct state validation errors because state returns cannot be filed unless corrections are made. Here are some examples of common state validation errors that we see. In this example, we see some errors related to the M1PR, that's the property tax return. So for example, M1PR is not required to be filed if the total refund is 0. Please remove the M1PR and file the M1 only. Or filing as a renter, but no rent information was entered. That means you didn't enter the CRP, the form from the landlord, completely. Filing as a mobile homeowner, but neither Form CRP or prop statement was entered. Again, that means either the CRP or the property statement were incomplete or missed. The counterintuitive part here is that this button, Make Corrections, doesn't actually do what you think it does. It doesn't bring you to the screens where you make corrections. I don't know why. So on the state validation errors, ignore this button, Make Corrections, and instead just enter the state tax return and find the section that you need. It might be helpful to make a brief note of the errors that it's giving you before you click Continue and go into the state tax return. The e-file section. The e-file section is the final section of TaxSlayer. So after you have entered both the federal and state tax information and you've printed the tax return to a PDF to do your initial check of your work, next, after that, you'll move on to the e-file section. The e-file section tracks important details about sending the return. Prepare and Prosper requires only some of these sections. So you'll notice here that this is the progress bar through the e-file section. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages on here, 3 of which we don't use. So we use return details. We skip fee summary because we don't charge for our services. We enter the bank account information. That's how the direct deposit works. We skip the state ID and license because we don't collect collect the information about customers' IDs, although we do verify them at the beginning, the photo ID. We have the taxpayer's consent to make sure that they're consenting to us using their data, which we're going to talk about in a little later this evening. There are some custom questions that Prepare and Prosper asks on the Prepare and Prosper intake paperwork. Custom credits we skip over. And finally, the submission page. You, as preparers, won't do a whole lot on this page, but the reviewers and the tax site managers use it to finalize a tax return and then to transmit the tax returns to the IRS and Minnesota Revenue. Okay, return details. Return type, how to send. So remember, we have 2 ways to submit a tax return, both for federal and for state. We have e-filing, which is sending the return electronically to the IRS and to Minnesota Revenue. Much, much quicker processing times. And we have paper file, sending the return by mail. Significantly longer processing times. Now we can't quote really a turnaround time for either one of these because it depends on the taxpayer's specific situation. On average, or generally speaking, an e-file tax return that doesn't have problems with it or that isn't flagged for further review, usually about 2 to 3 weeks, but we can't guarantee anything. And paper file, I have no idea. A long time. I can tell you I paper filed my own tax return for 2019, I think it was, and it took like 5 months. So, and that was before the pandemic even, before budget cuts to the IRS. So no idea how long it would take for a paper file. We try to avoid paper file when we can. Ultimately, it's the customer's decision for the most part. In some situations, which we'll talk about a little later tonight, we have to do a paper file, but we strongly encourage customers, if e-file is available, to e-file, but we're not going to force them. Why someone has to paper file? Okay, I guess we're talking about this much sooner than I thought. These are examples of where we have to do the paper filing and not the e-filing. So if somebody is filing married, filing separate, so a separate tax return from their spouse, and they don't have their spouse's social security number or ITIN available, we have to paper file that. If they're filing an older tax year, so anything before 2023, which would be 2020, 2021, or 2022, because we don't do anything older than 2020, we have to paper file those because IRS and Minnesota Revenue don't accept those by e-file anymore. Or the customer declines one or more consents. There are four different consents, different things we ask them to consent to. Three of them are super important. If they decline even one of those three, we have to paper file because we're going to delete their tax return from our system after we print it. Page 33 of your manual has more examples that are not as common. Return types, we have refund or balance due. A refund is when the customer receives money back when filing. Everybody loves that. And a balance due is when the customer must make a payment to pay the balance of their income tax that hasn't been paid yet when they're filing. With a refund, they can choose a direct deposit, which means the refund goes to a bank account. With a balance due, they can do a direct debit, which is like direct deposit in reverse. The balance that's due is withdrawn electronically from a bank account. Another option for a refund is a paper check. The refund comes as a check in the mail. And similarly for balance due, mail a payment. This is a little misleading, mail a payment, because it's not only by mail. It's the balance due is paid later via mail or paid online. In both of these situations, the taxpayer has to act, either by sending the payment in the mail or by going online and initiating the payment, which would be, if online, would be electronic from a bank account. There's a question here. I thought they said paper checks were not happening. We're going to talk about that in 1 second, actually. Not on this screen, but paper checks are available still for both IRS and Minnesota Revenue. The federal government is in the process of phasing out checks for all federal government services, but that hasn't actually happened yet. We'll talk about that a few slides ahead of now. So entering return types. The final return type is a combination of how the return will be transmitted, so either electronically, which is an e-file, or paper file, where the customer mails the tax return, and how the taxpayer will get a refund or pay a balance. So direct deposit or paper check for refunds, direct debit, mail a payment, and make a payment online for balance due. So you will set a return type for each return the taxpayer has. Remember, there are three possible tax returns. There's the federal tax return, the Minnesota tax return called M1, and if the taxpayer is a homeowner, not a renter, but a homeowner, then Minnesota M1PR, which is the property tax refund. This is an example of one of the pages on the e-file section that we looked at, where you set how the returns will be transmitted and how the taxpayer will get the refund or pay the balance due. So for the federal return, in this case, the customer has a federal refund of $6,484. In this case, we have it set to e-file direct deposit, meaning we're going to transmit the tax return to the IRS, the federal tax return, electronically, and the refund is going to be sent by direct deposit to the customer's bank account or accounts, plural. This example only transmit the state return is in situations where we're not actually filing a federal tax return. But we are filing state. That generally happens when we're doing the Minnesota property tax refund only, and the customers don't have enough income to have to file a federal tax return or a state tax return. And then the state return, how would the client like to send their tax return? In this case, this customer is getting a state refund of $1,886 for their state tax return, the M1. Again, in this example, we have e-file direct deposit selected. So we send the tax return to Minnesota Revenue electronically, and Minnesota Revenue sends the refund via direct deposit to the customer's bank account. Only one account, which we'll talk about in a little bit, about how we can split tax refunds into multiple accounts in some cases and not in others. And the final example here is the Minnesota M1PR, the property tax refund. Same example here, we're sending this property tax refund return to Minnesota Revenue by e-file, and the refund is coming directly to the customer's bank account via direct deposit. Refund options. Okay, we have direct deposit, which is directly deposited electronically to the customer's checking account or savings account. We also can do a CFR prepaid debit card if they don't have a checking or savings account that they want to use. They can split the refund on the federal tax return. So the federal tax return, if a refund is due, they can split it into 2 accounts instead of doing just one. And number 3, receive a paper check. This is an okay option for Minnesota. The IRS is phasing out checks. More information coming soon. This is an example of the Prepare and Prosper intake paperwork where we ask the taxpayers or the customers, if you get a refund, how do you want to receive it? Direct deposited into savings or checking account, need a new bank account or prepaid card for my refunds. I want to split my federal refund into multiple bank accounts. I want to receive a check in the mail. Or if I have a balance due, or if you have a balance due, how do you want to make a tax payment? I need more information so I can pay later. In that case, we get instructions on how to pay later. Or I want the payment to come out of my checking or savings account. This is the direct debit option. Remember, we do have the save and win contest. If customers save at least a portion of their refund into a savings account, direct deposit into a savings account, then they get entered into a contest to win $100. Okay, bank account. Entering direct deposit. This is the bank account entry screen in TaxSlayer. You'll see here that we indicate the account type, so checking or savings. Please be sure to get this right. It's the documentation is the source document is super important in this case, because if you get this wrong, the refund will not go through. So it's not required to enter the bank name. You can leave the bank name blank. Minnesota refunds go to the first account listed. You'll see as we do a live example of finishing the tax return that we can enter multiple bank accounts, because the federal tax return, if there's a refund due, can be split into more than one account. But Minnesota always goes into bank account 1. We can't split Minnesota. Here's a money moment split refund. A split refund makes saving part of a refund easy. Spend some now and save some for later, i.e., direct deposit some of the federal refund into savings for later and some into checking for now. Federal tax returns can be split into multiple accounts. Minnesota refunds cannot be split. The Minnesota refunds always go into the first account entered in TaxSlayer. So bank account number 1 is always where the Minnesota refunds go. Another money moment, save and win. If a customer saves $50 or more into a savings account and enters the contest by talking to a customer support volunteer, one of the other volunteers at the tax site, and signing the financial services form, they can win one of the weekly $100 prizes or stay in the drawing until summer tax preparation ends. So once they enter, they are in every week's drawing until either they win or the contest ends. So we say $50 or more into a savings account. So they need to have a refund of at least $50. And if it's a federal tax return refund, they could, for example, put $50 into the savings account, direct deposit, and all the rest in the checking if they want. Okay, question. Do we preparer need to validate that the bank account belongs to the taxpayer? Yes and no. If it's always best to look at the source document. So for example, if they want to do a direct deposit into a checking account and they have their checkbook with them, the best place to take that information from is a blank check. They could void a check, or you could just look at it directly from the checkbook. Sometimes they have a previous year's tax return where we collect the bank account information from, in which case we can reasonably infer that that bank account belongs to them. Otherwise, we don't ask for documentation specifically about ownership. We'll take their word for it. If something seems off, like if you think that something might be like a fraud kind of situation, get the tax site manager involved discreetly, and the tax site manager will navigate that situation. You wouldn't have to do that. Direct deposit documentation. Where does the direct deposit info get documented? For routing and account numbers, a good practice is to use a document showing the routing and account numbers, such as a blank check, like I just mentioned, or the previous year's tax return. An alternate option would be to write the numbers on page 4 for Prepare and Prosper's tax intake sheet and confirm with the customer. A lot of times the customers will write this information for you on the intake paperwork, in which case it's always a good idea to ask if they have the source where they wrote this information so that you can double check it too, because if even one number is off, it turns into a giant hassle and delay for the customer. So we try to be really, really careful and diligent about the account information. Incorrect information can delay refunds by several weeks. Okay, next we have taxpayer consent and custom questions. Entering consents. As I mentioned, we have 4 different things that we ask our customers to consent to. 3 of the 4 are required in order for us to e-file, so electronically transmit the tax returns. Let's look at them first. So Prepare and Prosper permission to use your information section from the Prepare and Prosper tax intake sheet. These 3 right here. Returns cannot be e-filed if a taxpayer wishes to decline one of the Prepare and Prosper consents. So you'll see there's 3 things here that we're asking them to consent to, which is Prepare and Prosper may keep an electronic copy of my tax return for up to 6 years. Prepare and Prosper may use anonymous data containing tax return dollar amounts for marketing, etc., fundraising, or other non-fundraising activity. And Prepare and Prosper may disclose my tax return information to TaxSlayer, which is our tax preparation software, in order to e-file the tax return. And TaxSlayer may disclose my tax return information to Prepare and Prosper for follow-up. Ideally, the customer says yes to all 3 of these. If they say no to even one of them, we can prepare the tax return, but we cannot e-file it, which means we'll be printing copies for them to mail. Generally speaking, if you see any of these marked no, your best bet is to ask your tax site manager for assistance. The tax site manager can talk to the customer and see what concerns they have about consenting and maybe alleviate those concerns so that the customer would consent, and then we can e-file it. But we're not going to pressure anybody. The customer has every right to say no to any one of these 3. We'll still prepare the tax return. We just won't file it electronically. We'll print copies for the customer to mail to IRS and Minnesota Revenue. The other consent is on the IRS intake sheet. So this yellow sheet right here. This is the IRS intake sheet global carry forward consent. This allows TaxSlayer to carry forward their data from one tax year to another. For example, if we prepared their tax return last year, then if they consented to this last year, then we can carry forward their social security number, their address, their phone number, their dependents, their W-2 data from last year to simplify the data entry this year. So from one year to another. This one, if they don't accept it, if they decline it, not a big deal. We can easily change that setting in TaxSlayer and we can still e-file. So the point is here, we need consents for all 3 on this Prepare and Prosper intake paperwork in order to e-file. If they decline 1, 2, or 3 of these, ask your tax site manager to talk to the customer. No big deal if they still decline. We just need a paper file instead of e-file. Entering the custom questions. So the answers come from page 1 of the Prepare and Prosper intake sheet. We have it right here under the taxpayer survey. Only enter the questions marked required. So you'll see, for example, on here, questions in this screenshot all are required, but you'll also see questions with different numbers that don't say required. So if it doesn't say required, you don't need to answer it. And the questions here in TaxSlayer correspond to the questions here on the intake paperwork. Finally, the submission page. This is the page that you as preparers don't do a whole lot with, but the reviewers and the tax site managers do more with. You're going to end up skipping most of the sections on this page. but you will use the customized return tags or return status tags when appropriate for the return. So for example, if the customer is a saver, meaning they deposit some or all of the refund into a savings account, direct deposit, you'll check this box for saver. Self-employment clinic, you won't use unless you're volunteering in the self-employment tax clinic. Power of attorney, if the tax return is prepared by a power of attorney. Spanish, if they're a Spanish speaker. ITIN application, paper return, if they also need to apply for the ITIN. And paper return, if it's a paper return and it's done, meaning printed, I think the reviewer would actually check this one, because that then signals, depending if we're doing a paper return because they declined the cents, that would be our signal that we're ready to delete the return from TaxSlayer. After the preparation, mark the return ready for review. So right down here under transmit return, e-file the completed tax return, you will check mark tax return ready for review, which allows the reviewers to review the tax return after you drop it off for review. If you forget to check this box, mark tax return ready for review, I can guarantee you, you're going to get some feedback from the reviewers, because it's a million more clicks for them if you don't check this box for them to get into the tax return and review it. Okay, we're going to go into the TaxSlayer Practice Lab here. If you are going to enter the TaxSlayer Practice Lab yourself at the same time as me, remember to enter Train Pro Web first. And we're going to be using Tina Parker's tax return, the same one we've been using the last few training sessions. And what we're going to do is finish Tina Parker's tax return using what we just learned. It's okay if you didn't get everything entered. The practice lab has a glitch where you can't e-file the state, just select paper return. I'll walk you through this. So again, you can either watch me and do it yourself in TaxSlayer at the same time if you have a setup for that. Otherwise, just watch me, I'll guide you. This is what we're going to do. We're going to go through and finish these sections of the e-file section of the tax return. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go to the TaxSlayer Practice Lab. Remember, you can get there by going to Prepare and Prosper's website, go to Volunteer Resources, Training Site, Basic Tax Training, and Practice Lab. Remember, every time you enter the Practice Lab, we always enter the generic password Train Pro Web in uppercase letters. Then you can enter the username and password that you created for the Practice Lab. Go to the practice area. Remember, for training, we're using tax year 2024. I'll do a client search to see the tax returns that I've already started in tax year 2024. And here's Tina Parker. And we are going to finish this tax return. I like to click this icon of the push pin right here to keep the navigation bar open. And I jump down to e-file. Okay, we have a state validation error. Preparer name is required for electronic filing. I think this is just a glitch in the TaxSlayer Practice Lab. This is an example of where clicking Make Corrections doesn't actually bring you to where you need to go. But we're just going to continue. And here are the 8 screens that we just looked at. These 8 right here, where we work through 5 of them and skip 3 of them. Okay, so the return details, we are going to enter. So the federal return, how do we want this refund? Let's do e-file direct deposit. And the state return, we are going to do for the Minnesota state return and paper return. I think the instructions told us. The practice lab has a glitch where you can't e-file the state, just select paper return. So I'm selecting paper return for the Minnesota state refund because of this glitch in the practice lab. And I selected e-file direct deposit for the federal refund. All right, let's continue. We skip fee summary because Prepare and Prosper does not charge for its services. We'll continue. The bank account. Okay, let's look at Tina's documentation here from her intake paperwork. Looking for the documentation of her. Here we go. We see that Tina has a checking account and a savings account, both at Bremer Bank. So we can enter up to 3 bank accounts. So let's pretend she wants to split this federal refund. Her federal refund is $6,435. So let's say she wants to put $6,000 into checking and $435 into savings. I'll put $6,000 into checking, and then I'll grab this routing number 09601 0415. Bank account info is 6693121. Enter again 09601 0415. And the bank account checking is 6693121. Now remember, her federal refund is $6,435. I selected $6,000 for this first account, so I've got to put the remaining $435 into another account. We'll do savings. 435. Routing number is 09601 0415 09601 0415. This is a lot easier when you have it like on a piece of paper, so you're not flipping screens constantly. 09601 0415. And the savings account number is 6995404. Okay.
Let me show you.
Was there a question? Okay. I'll click continue. State ID and license, we skip. Remember, we saw a skip for state ID license. So just continue. The taxpayer consent. Remember, we have different consents that the taxpayer must consent. And in this case, we're going to look at the paperwork and see what the customer consented to and did not consent to. We look at the Prepare and Prosper intake paperwork first. We see that Tina consented to all 3 of Prepare and Prosper's consents. And on the IRS paperwork, the last page of this yellow sheet, she also consented to the global carry forward data for TaxSlayer. So we are going to accept the consents. The PIN that we use for the taxpayer, it's going to ask for the taxpayer primary PIN, is the customer's zip code. So we just find their address, and zip code is 55408. Primary PIN date is the current date. Done. Okay, the custom questions we're going to find on the Prepare and Prosper intake paperwork. Right here under taxpayer survey. So would you say you can carry on a conversation in English, both understanding and speaking? I think actually some of these come from the IRS paperwork as well. Yep. Okay. Would you say you can carry on a conversation in English? Oh, recall that I said on one of those slides, I need to look at that slide again because I think it said we need to answer the ones, only the questions that say required, if I remember correctly. Let's find that. Okay. Only enter questions marked required. So none of these are marked as required. We're going to skip. I think that in this TaxSlayer Practice Lab, these questions don't match what we actually have.
Mike, if I can jump in and add
Yeah.
that, yeah, in the actual clinics, what we do is we hit continue. So the system flags the required questions. Then we go back, answer those specific questions. I remember we were doing this
Okay.
last year.
Well, it didn't flag the questions, and none of these say required. So I think this is an example of just where the practice lab doesn't match the real TaxSlayer that we're using. When you're doing a real tax return in the real TaxSlayer, you'll see questions marked as required or that don't say required, and they'll match the questions on the taxpayer survey on the intake paperwork. Okay, so we're going to continue to custom credits, which we skip. I need to get back to where we were. We skip custom credits. And the submission page. This is telling us electronic filing will not be available until January 2026, date TBD. Fun fact, the IRS usually doesn't open the e-filing until like the end of January, sometimes even early February. So the tax returns that we prepare for the first week or so of the season will actually be held for until the e-filing at the IRS opens, and then our full-time staff at the main office will take care of the filing. So we can see here the federal return with the refund of $6,435 being with e-file direct deposit, e-filing being the transmission method, direct deposit being how the refund is sent. Minnesota state refund of $4,341. This was the glitch we saw in TaxSlayer Practice Lab, so we just selected paper return instead of e-file and direct deposit. If we want, we can click these buttons to see the full account numbers and routing numbers. The reviewers will use this printing the tax documents, because even if we e-file the tax return, we also print a copy for the customer's records. If we need to mark any return tags, or set return status tags, we do that here. None that we need to check because none of these apply. And not the most important, but a very important part, ready for review. Save and exit. This return has been successfully submitted for review. So now the reviewers will see it in their queue. And then once the envelope with all the documentation arrives, they will be able to review it. Okay. Does anybody have questions about what we just looked at with the e-file section? Okay, so Sandra says, I couldn't track in TaxSlayer because I ran up against ACA health insurance data requirements. Did I miss a step from earlier sessions? I don't remember if we did I didn't do every single training session, but I'll show you likely what it's telling you. And that is, this section right here, health insurance. It's probably telling you need to answer this question. So this question is not worded the best. Did you, your spouse, or dependent have insurance under the Affordable Care Act? What that's asking really is, did you purchase your own policy that you pay monthly premiums for on minsure.com? The vast majority of customers, it's going to be no. Only a very small subset will be yes. So you need to answer yes or no and then click continue, and that should resolve that error message, the validation. Okay, we're going to talk really quickly about your role with balance due returns. This is when, instead of getting a refund, the customer owes a balance, either to the IRS or to Minnesota Revenue, or both. For tax years 2024 and 2025, make sure the customer understands why they have a balance due and help them make a plan for handling it. For tax year 2025 specifically, you can offer a handout. We have a handout called Paying a Balance Due. The reviewers automatically attach this handout to the tax return whenever there is a balance due. They could consider changing their withholding. That's actually another document that we offer about how the Form W-4 works. That's the form that you fill out whenever you start a new job that tells your employer how much to withhold in income taxes. They also could make other adjustments to increase their payments. For example, they could make estimated income tax payments throughout the year. Not the best option for a lot of customers, but it certainly is possible. Filing with a balance due. The deadline for filing a return and paying a balance due is April 15th, 2026. So the extension to file allows 6 months to file, but does not change the deadline to pay. So if somebody needs longer to prepare and file their tax returns, they can get a 6-month extension, but if they have a balance due, they still have to pay it by April 15th. The tax site managers or reviewers will help you navigate that situation. Customers should always file, even if they can't pay the balance, because the penalty for not filing or not filing an extension and then filing 6 months later is much bigger than the penalty for not paying a balance due on time. Common reasons for a balance due. Form W-4. This is the form I just mentioned that whenever you start a new job, you fill this out with your employer so they know how much tax to withhold. Life events may change employee tax situations and withholdings must be adjusted, like getting married or divorced, having children, for example. No tax withheld. That can create a large balance due if income is high enough to owe taxes. Multiple jobs. This is what we see most commonly. When people have multiple jobs and the different employers don't know about the other jobs and they withhold only enough money, assuming that that one job is their only income, but then they have other jobs, and so the total tax liability is higher. So having multiple jobs can complicate the withholding calculation because employers withhold based only on the income from their company, unless they know to withhold more. Or life changes. Not claiming a dependent or changes in marital and filing status can significantly change the tax return. Taxpayers can use the IRS withholding estimator throughout the year to better predict their withholding. Options to pay a balance due. We have e-file direct debit. So the direct debit is the opposite of direct deposit, where the money is automatically withdrawn from the bank account electronically. Comes out of the bank account. The customer needs to choose a date. It can be immediate, which means it generally happens the next business day, or as late as April 15th. And they need to sign the balance due authorization. We have a form for that. E-file mail payment. So remember, this is more than just mailing a payment. This is either mailing a payment or going online and initiating a direct debit on demand. Online is the best option. They can send it payment in the mail or in person. They can pay both the IRS and Minnesota Revenue in person. If they can't make the full payment, they can make partial payments. They can set up a payment plan. Both the IRS and Minnesota Revenue will be happy to set them up on a payment plan. There is interest involved. Or they can consult with an LITC, which is a low-income taxpayer clinic. We can refer them to that service for help if a balance due creates a financial hardship. Again, your tax site manager can help you navigate these situations. Some basics about direct debit. Direct debit can be good or challenging. So here's how it can be good. It's easy to set up when filing a tax return. The funds come out of the account directly, and the payment date can be set to any date between the current date and April 15th, so whatever date the customer wants. And here's how it can be challenging. The funds may come out when an account balance is low. The direct debits are going to happen on the dates that the customer selects, regardless of what the balance is. So if they don't have enough money in the accounts, the direct debit could bounce. The funds may come out when the account balance is low. Payments can happen at an unexpected time. If, for example, the customer forgets that they selected the date for that direct debit. It may cause overdraft fees or inability to pay other important expenses on time. Question here in the chat, does a low-income tax clinic help someone get assistance paying a balance due? I'm not entirely sure of the services the low income tax clinic does. We do have some documentation at the tax site with more information about what they actually do, but I don't have that documentation here in the training. So when you're at the tax site, you could ask, for example, the tax site manager for the documentation on the referrals to the low income tax clinic to learn more about what exactly that low income tax clinic might do. This is the paying a balance due handout that I mentioned earlier. The reviewers attach this handout to any tax return that has a balance due. And the customer support volunteers go over this handout with the customer during the checkout process when there's a balance due. So this gives an overview of both for the IRS, the federal tax return, and Minnesota for the state tax return, how to pay a balance due either by going online, by sending the payment by mail, or by paying in person, or setting up a payment plan. So when somebody doesn't have the money to pay the entire balance at once, they can set up a payment plan with either the IRS or Minnesota Revenue or both to do installment payments. Other options may be available if paying a balance due is a significant burden. That's the low income tax clinic that we mentioned. There's a question here, or a follow-up. I had that question too about the low income tax clinic. I found that actually going through the payment process can be tough for some people, not the money part, the paying part. Certainly, with a lot of our customers, resources are definitely limited. So what might seem like an inconsequential or not that bad of a tax bill to us can be detrimental to some of our clients,
Oh
depending.
no, if I could just clarify really quick,
Go
not
for it.
the actual, not like having the resource to pay, like actually physically paying it. Like some people don't understand how to pay the IRS or Minnesota.
Okay, so that process of affecting the payment.
Correct.
Okay, yep. And so that we can sometimes help them with that. For example, the best option would be probably the mail option. We can help them get the form filled out. Then all I have to do is write the check and stick it in the mail with the form. You can talk to the tax site manager if the customer needs assistance with that, or sometimes even if they want to set up an online payment right there at the tax site, usually we can have a tax site manager or a more experienced volunteer help them through that as well. Thank you for speaking up. This is the Form W-4 handout. So recall the Form W-4 is the form you fill out whenever you start a new job. It tells your employer it helps your employer figure out how much tax to withhold. So if not enough taxes were withheld on the paycheck, we generally give this handout to the customer, which explains what the Form W-4 is and how it works, and how to go about having more income taxes withheld from their paycheck so that they don't have a balance due again the following year. Okay, it is time for a 10-minute break. So let's come back here at 7:11. Thank you, everybody. Are going to continue. Okay. Now what? So review volunteer checklist to confirm you have completed all items in the preparation checklist. This is after you've gone through the e-file section in TaxSlayer. Add notes to ensure they are complete enough for someone else to understand. Explain the next steps to the customer and invite them to wait in the waiting area. This part is super important. It's really important to know that not every customer knows the process, and sometimes even returning customers don't remember from previous years that they need to wait for the quality review process. So it's super important to tell them that their next step is to wait in the waiting area while the quality review happens, and probably tell them that the reviewers might ask them, meaning ask the customers for details if there's something that's not clear that they want to double check. And that the customer should not leave the tax site until the review is finished and the checkout process is complete. Generally speaking, it's fine if they want to go outside, get a breath of fresh air. Sometimes smoke, or if they want to use the bathroom, no problem at all. If they do leave the tax site, they should check in with the customer support volunteer, who functions more or less as a receptionist in that respect, but also they do a lot of other work too, not just reception. Hand off the financial services form to the customer support volunteer if you haven't done so already. Really important that the financial services form goes to the customer support volunteer even earlier in the process, or at least by the time you're done with the preparation. We don't want this form to go sit in the folder waiting for review, because it's just going to sit there unused, and we're losing valuable time that the customer support volunteers can use to talk to the customers about financial services. And the customer envelope. Put all items in the customer envelope and put it in the queue for the reviewer. So remember, the volunteer checklists are, I don't know if we have actually in the, we might not have a copy of it. No, we don't have a copy of it. Oh, we do. Okay. The volunteer checklists. So remember, there's a pink sheet with the volunteer checklist with each customer. So be sure that you fill out the preparation checklist right here. And if the customer support volunteer did not do the screening before the customer came to see you as a tax preparer, make sure you do the screening and fill out the screening checklist as well. Fun fact, the first customer that you serve in each shift, you're going to be doing the screening and filling out the screening for, because the customer support volunteers don't have enough time to screen before the first customers come back. And you'll be doing it for other customers as well, but at least for the first customers. So remember to fill out the volunteer checklists. There are 4 checklists, one for screening, one for preparation. You'll always do the preparation one. You might do the screening one, depending. Then there's the review checklist, which the reviewers do, and the checkout checklist, which the customer support volunteers do. Review levels. Okay, this is new for this tax season. When finished with the return, please label the customer envelope with the level of return. Level 1 is for very basic returns, such as W-2 only, renter's credit, or M1PR only, no dependents. Level 2 is for basic returns with a complicating factor, such as education credits, dependents, or other credits. Level 3 is for advanced returns, paper file returns, or returns with questions for an experienced reviewer. I'm guessing that most of you are going to be certified at the basic level, which means you'd be labeling all of yours as level 1 or level 2. Although sometimes as a basic preparer, you will get a customer with advanced topics, and in which case you'll talk to the tax site manager about how to proceed. In some cases, the tax site manager will reassign that customer to an advanced preparer. In other examples, the tax site manager will ask you to complete all of the basic portions of the tax return and then do the advanced portions themselves, in which case you would be labeling that envelope with level 3. This is new for 2026 for this tax year, so I don't have a lot of details on exactly how this looks, so watch for more information being communicated, probably at the tax site, but possibly in advance of that. TaxSlayer sticky note. It is possible to make notes inside the tax return in TaxSlayer. If you go up near the top, you click on the customer's name here after you're already in the tax return. This is the top right corner. See, this is the name of the taxpayer. Click on the name and go down to Notes. You can then add a note about that customer and their tax return. So you can write notes about situations that need follow-up in the future, such as issues with the return, missing documents. Examples of missing documents might be CRPs, the form CRP from the landlord if they're a renter, income statements for any kind of income, Social Security number or ITIN source documents, such as the Social Security card or other acceptable forms of documentation for Social Security numbers. Power of attorney or other uncommon situations can be documented in the sticky notes as well. Make sure to add the date and your name, otherwise nobody knows who added the note or when. So just add the date and your name so everybody knows the source of that note. Some uncommon situations and forms. Non-resident for tax purposes. Non-residents for tax purposes must file Form 1040 NR, NR meaning non-resident, and non-resident tax returns are out of scope at Prepare and Prosper. Reminder in some of the first few pages of the volunteer manual, we have the more information about what is in scope and out of scope. So non-resident returns are out of scope of Prepare and Prosper. Many international students need to file non-resident returns. Taxpayers who are not U.S. citizens may be considered a resident for tax purposes. Examples include individuals with a green card or individuals who meet the substantial presence test, including most ITIN holders. So remember, somebody who's not a citizen might still be filing a tax return. That is a thing. Minnesota part-year residents and non-residents. So Minnesota tax is based on income earned in Minnesota while living or working in Minnesota. Taxpayers who lived or worked in another state often need to file multiple state returns. For example, a common situation that we see is when the taxpayer lived in Wisconsin for part of the year and in Minnesota for part of the year. They worked and lived in Wisconsin for a while and then moved to Minnesota and lived and worked in Minnesota. And they need to file both Minnesota and Wisconsin tax returns in addition to the federal tax return. Prepare and Prosper can prepare their federal and Minnesota tax returns, but returns for any state other than Minnesota is out of scope for Prepare and Prosper. So we don't do Wisconsin tax returns. We don't do Iowa tax returns. Generally speaking, it's the best practice to have all 3 tax returns done at the same time, in which case we give the taxpayer options. We can offer to do the federal and Minnesota tax return and tell them that they're on their own for getting the Wisconsin tax return prepared, in which case we'd probably refer them to a CPA, a certified public accountant. But if we're already referring them to the CPA for the Wisconsin tax return, it makes most sense for that CPA to do all 3. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way. One thing to note is that not every state has a state income tax return. So customers who lived in Texas, Florida, South Dakota, for example, for part of the year and then moved to Minnesota, not a big deal because those 3 states don't even have state tax returns. So they wouldn't have to file a tax return for any of those states. If you're not sure, just ask your tax site manager for help. If the tax site manager doesn't know the answer, the tax site manager also has a whole bunch of resources to use, including a phone a friend option. Identity protection PIN. The IRS issues identity protection PINs to taxpayers who experience tax-related identity theft. So a taxpayer, a spouse, or a dependent, or all 3 might have an identity protection PIN. This is often due to a fraudulently filed return using that taxpayer's social security number. Even if there was no tax fraud, taxpayers can opt themselves into the identity protection PIN program, even if there has been no fraud or ID theft. One important thing to note here is that once a taxpayer is in the identity protection PIN program, either because they opted themselves in or the IRS did it on their behalf, they can never get out of it, ever. And the PIN changes every year. The IRS, I think it's in the next slide. Yes, the IP PIN form. So the identity protection PIN letters are mailed to taxpayers by the IRS in December or January, and the number is new every year. So the identity protection PIN that they used last year is not the same as the one they use this year. And the identity protection PIN isn't based on the tax year, it's based on the year in which they're filing. So there's one identity protection PIN to use for any tax return filed between January 1st and December 31st, 2025, regardless of the tax year, and a new PIN for any tax return filed between January 1st and December 31st. The dates might be a little different, I don't know exactly, 2026. So if they don't know the number, or don't just use the identity protection PIN from the previous year, because that return will definitely be rejected. If they don't know the identity protection PIN, like if they lost it or they don't have the letter from the IRS, they can look it up online, or if they don't have access to going online, or maybe that's not the best fit for them, they can also call the IRS for further instructions. The identity protection PIN must be included on the return for any year being filed. Returns filed without the identity protection PIN will be rejected. And paper filed returns without an identity protection PIN will delay return processing. So the point here, I don't know exactly, but I think this is one of the most common reasons for a return being rejected that we see. For example, I, as a tax site manager, can go in and see which returns from the site that I work at have been rejected. And that's the most common reason I see, is because the identity protection pin is either wrong or missing. So yeah, if the return does get rejected, the full-time staff at Prepare and Prosper will follow up with the taxpayer and resubmit it once the taxpayer gets the accurate identity protection pin, but it slows down the entire process. Filing on behalf of a living person. This is a power of attorney, or POA. The power of attorney authorizes a representative to act on a taxpayer's behalf for tax matters. Family members are the most common powers of attorney. For example, a taxpayer with a spouse who lives abroad, or a child filing for an elderly parent. The representative, that is the power of attorney, must have a valid IRS power of attorney form, Form 2848, even if they also have a court authorized or approved power of attorney, they also need to fill out Form 2848. Prepare and Prosper's volunteer manual provides tips on what to look for on Form 2848. Your best bet is to ask your tax site manager for assistance. This can get kind of complex. It doesn't come up all that often, but I see it usually once or twice a year, a tax season. Filing on behalf of a deceased taxpayer. A deceased taxpayer may need to file a tax return. The personal representatives or surviving spouse will generally file that tax return on behalf of the decedent, the deceased person. Reminder, a surviving spouse can often file married filing joint in the year of the spouse's death. So if the person died in 2025 and the spouse is surviving, the spouse in most cases can file married filing joint for 2025, and the deceased spouse does not need to file a separate tax return. A representative may need guidance on where to get missing tax information or what forms are needed. Ask your tax site manager for assistance in this case. And remember to be compassionate in the tax interview. A person's passing may be very emotional for the representative. In fact, it's almost always emotional. Forms for the deceased. A representative may need guidance on where to get missing tax information. Complete additional forms to claim a refund if the surviving spouse is not the filer. Form 1310 with the federal tax return and Form M23 for the Minnesota income tax return. Again, you'll find this documentation in your volunteer manual. Special rules for claiming a property tax refund. Only a surviving spouse or dependent of the decedent may claim the refund. So we're not talking about the federal tax return or the state tax return. We're talking about the property tax refund when the decedent owned a home and was claiming the property tax refund. Only the surviving spouse or a dependent of the decedent may claim that refund. Amendments and prior year returns. This is the amendment decision tree. If you're not familiar, an amendment is when a tax return is filed and approved by the IRS or Minnesota Revenue, or both, and then we need to change it. The customer needs to change something. They need to amend or change that tax return, which often results in a larger refund or a smaller refund, a greater balance due, smaller balance due, etc. This is the decision tree that we use to determine if Prepare and Prosper will prepare and file the amendment or not. Was the original tax return filed by Prepare and Prosper? If yes, then the customer submits Prepare and Prosper's amendment request form. We have copies at the tax site, and the tax site manager can help with that. If Prepare and Prosper did not prepare and file the original tax return, was the return filed elsewhere or using the DIY service, Prepare and Prosper's DIY service? The only option here is yes. We're going to keep going. Is the amendment only to add one or more CRPs to the state return? If yes, we keep going. If no, we aren't going to do the amendment. So assuming that it is only to add one or more CRPs to the state return, then we need to ask, does the customer have the original filed state return and all of their CRPs? If yes, then we can move forward with the amendment. Generally speaking, during the tax season, we don't do amendments. We just fill out this amendment request form, which then gets processed during the summer and fall. And if you volunteer in the summer and early fall, we do a lot of amendments at that time. Prior year highlights. So you can see prior year tax highlights in your Prepare and Prosper Tax Manual. That shows you the most important things to know that are different in previous years compared to the current year. We also have prior year tax manual, so the volunteer manual for each tax year on the training site. So if you're working on a tax return for a tax year other than 2025, your best bets are either to look at your volunteer manual for tax year 2025 and go to page 189. For prior year returns, you'll see here for 2024 what the most important differences were, 2023 what the most important differences were. Or even better, if you go to the training site that we looked at, you can find I don't know exactly where it is on here, but this is the current year's volunteer tax manual. We do have previous year. Here we go. The tax manual archive. So on that first page of the Prepare and Prosper Volunteer website, I clicked on Preparing and Reviewing, which is right below Basic Tax Training. And I went down to Tax Manual Archive. So let's say you're doing a tax return for tax year 2021. Bam, here's the volunteer manual for tax year 2021. And that makes life a whole lot easier. The only thing is for the previous year's manuals, we have them only electronically. We don't have the paper copies. At the main office, they probably still have paper copies, but at every other site, only electronic copies of previous year manuals. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Filing deadlines, the federal and state income tax returns. So tax year 2025, which is mostly what you'll be doing for tax returns, the original deadline is April 15th, 2026. If the taxpayer files an extension with the IRS, they can get an automatic 6-month extension to file up until October 15th, 2026 without being late. The extension is only for the federal tax return. Minnesota grants an automatic 6-month extension, no extension form necessary. If the late return has a refund, then there's no fees or penalties for filing after either of these dates. Keep in mind there's only 3 years to claim refunds, so 3 years after the original deadline. That means that the IRS will not pay out a refund for a 2025 tax return that's filed after April 15th, 2029. So if someone's 3 years behind on their tax returns and they file their 2025 tax return on April 15th, 2029, they'll get the refund paid out. If they file it on April 16th, 2029, the IRS will say, thank you for filing, but you don't get your refund paid out. They don't actually say that, but they don't get there's no refund after that deadline. Now, if a balance is owed, the balance owed does not disappear after 3 years. The taxpayer owes that balance to the IRS or to Minnesota Revenue for the rest of their lives until it's paid off. And interest and penalties are incurred if the payments are not made on time. If they set up a payment plan, for example, they can avoid, I believe they can avoid some penalties, or the penalties are reduced, but the interest still accrues. Are these the same deadlines for filing an amended return? If there's a refund involved, then yes. So if an amended return results in an additional refund that wasn't paid out before, then yes, the 3-year deadline applies. So prior year deadlines. For tax year 2024, the original deadline to file was April 15, 2025. The refunds are available for 3 years after the deadline, so April 15, 2028 for a 2024 tax year. For 2023 tax year, the IRS will stop paying out refunds if the return is filed after April 15, 2027. Here's the 2022 tax year. You'll see here for 2021 and 2020, these deadlines have passed. So if you prepare a tax return for tax year 2021 or 2020 for a customer, and you probably will, and there's a refund due, the IRS won't pay it out. So it's unfortunate. And same with Minnesota Revenue, same deadlines. So refunds are still available for these tax years, 2025, which is the current tax year, and 2024, 2023, and 2022. Notice that the deadline for the 2022 tax return is coming up quick in about 3 months and a few days from now. So if you have customers with multiple years of tax returns, of course, always talk to your manager and make sure the tax site manager is comfortable with you working on more than 1 year of a tax return for one customer. Generally speaking, we start with the oldest one and work our way forward because the deadlines are coming sooner for the older tax returns. The tax site manager can help you navigate that prioritization process. Prior year returns, we can e-file 3 years of tax returns. So we can e-file, that is electronically transmit tax returns for tax year 2025, tax year 2024, and tax year 2023. Tax years 2022, 2021, and 2020 must be paper filed. So we print copies and the customer brings them to the post office, pays a lot of money in postage, and mails them to the IRS and to Minnesota Revenue. And we don't prepare tax returns that are earlier than 2020 tax year. When preparing prior year returns, use the prior year publications, which I just showed you. Understand the tax law changes each year. For example, the earned income tax credit has changed a lot over the last 6 years. So the requirements can be different from year to year for any tax credit and tax law. TaxSlayer will help with accurate calculations. If something doesn't seem right, just ask for help. Paperwork for multiple years of returns. Some taxpayers need to catch up on filing. For example, at my site that I work at, VITA in Bloomington, last year we saw more than one customer who had 6 years of tax returns to do. And it's not our place to judge or to lecture. We do our best to help the customers get caught up and everything on track. So each tax year that we're preparing should have a separate envelope. So you'll see when you get to the tax site, we have a large envelope to store the customer's documents. We'll have a separate envelope for each tax year. So if customer is doing 6 years of tax returns, we have 6 different envelopes for that customer, one for each year. Each year should have a volunteer checklist so that the screening and preparation checklist that we reviewed recently, you'll have a different one for each year. So that way you remember to do all the steps for each year. And all intake paperwork. This is where it gets a little fun because we don't expect customers to fill out all that intake paperwork every time from beginning, like from scratch for each tax year, because that could easily take 4 hours and then the shift's over before they're even done with the paperwork. So here's how we handle that. If we're doing multiple years of tax returns and the customer has a similar tax situation across all years, so not a lot of changes between the years, we take the original intake paperwork that they've already filled out for whichever year, we make photocopies of it, and then we note any differences. So cross out and rewrite something if it's different, or make a note next to it. That's generally speaking the way we do it. That's the most efficient way. Or if their tax situation has changed significantly across years, like if they got married or divorced, for example, or they were living in a different state in one year and then moved to Minnesota a different year, then we're going to make copies of the IRS and Prepare and Prosper intake sheets for each year, label with the tax year, and update the information. I didn't write this training, and I am not entirely sure what the difference is between these two. Bottom line is ask your tax site manager for assistance, and your tax site manager will help you navigate that situation. Generally speaking, I can tell you what I would do as a tax site manager. If there are big differences between 2 tax years, I'm probably going to ask them to fill out the paperwork again. But it would have to be a really, really big difference. Otherwise, we're just going to photocopy the paperwork they already filled out and then make notes and corrections on it for what's different in the other year. The Minnesota Homestead Credit, also called M1PR. This is an extra tax return for Minnesota. So most of our customers will file the federal tax return, which is Form 1040, and the Minnesota tax return, which is Form M1. There's also Form M1PR, which is a third tax return specifically for homeowners in Minnesota, not for renters. For renters, we have a credit inside the Minnesota tax return, the M1, for the renter's refund. For homeowners, we have this third return called the M1PR, or the Minnesota Homestead Credit Refund. So Form M1PR can be filed with or without an income tax return. The credit is calculated based on two main factors: the household income and the property tax paid. The due date for filing is not April 15th, but August 15th. It's common for us to prepare the M1PR along with the income taxes, but we don't always do that. And refunds are issued in the summer or fall. So if a customer does their federal tax return, state tax return, and the M1PR with Prepare and Prosper, they'll get their federal and state tax returns refunds usually within a few weeks, but they don't get this M1PR for several months, that refund. So it doesn't come out until summer or fall, usually August or September. Here are the qualifications for the homestead credit. A taxpayer may be eligible for a refund of up to $3,410. That's the maximum possible credit here. Most are going to be less. If they have income of less than $139,320 in 2025, which is much higher than our income limits, but keep in mind, sometimes we will prepare tax returns for people who are over our income limits, depending on the situation. The taxpayer is not a dependent. The taxpayer owns and occupies a home on January 2nd, 2026, lives in property classified as homestead, and does not owe delinquent property taxes on the homestead. The income, okay, there's a question. Is that the income limit married filing jointly or single? This is household income, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So it's not individual income, it's income of all adults in the household. So it's not going to matter whether they're single or married filing jointly. But we'll go over how this income works in a minute because it's different from everything we've seen before. To file the M1PR, we need the property tax statement. Now this part's this throws people off a little bit. To prepare the M1PR for 2025, we need the 2026 property tax statement. You'd think you would match year to year, like 2025 property tax statement for 2025 M1PR. Nope. We use the 2026 property tax statement for the 2025 M1PR. We use the 2025 property tax statement for the 2024 M1PR. And that's because the property tax statement shows the values and the property taxes both for the current year and the previous year, and we need both for the M1PR. So the statements are mailed out in March. The property tax statements are published by each county in Minnesota, and they start getting released in March. They're also available online. So if somebody does not have the paper copy of it, we can look it up online very easily if the county has released the property tax statements, which happens in March. You can look up the statement on the county websites. Depending on the site you work at, you may or may not have access to a printer. If you don't, the tax site manager can easily look it up and print it for you. Remember, we need the final property tax statement, the one that says tax statement. We don't need the valuation notice or proposed property tax statements. So you're going to have a lot of customers in February who come in and they're homeowners and they either don't have any documentation for their property taxes, or even more commonly, they bring in what they have so far, which is the proposed property tax statement or the valuation notice. Just look at the document very closely, make sure it says tax statement. We do have a workaround if the property tax statement, the final property tax statement, is not available yet. For example, every customer who's a homeowner who comes in February. And this is the workaround. This is called the homeowner plus mobile homeowner handout. So for taxpayers to submit property tax refund information later, we provide this form. You'll often hear it called the purple sheet. To the taxpayer, if property tax statements aren't available, basically what we do in this case, we'll prepare and file the federal and state tax returns, and we'll give this handout to the customer. When the customer gets their final property tax statement, they submit this form to us by mail or by fax, or even they can fill it out online by using that QR code. And then we'll submit the M1PR for them at that time, and they'll get the refund in August or September. Mobile homeowners. This is a little tricky sometimes because somebody who lives in a mobile home may be a renter or they may own that mobile home. If they own the mobile home, they are treated as a homeowner. So they often get a CRP for renting the lot if they don't own the lot. Most commonly, they rent the lot, that is the property that the mobile home sits on, the land, and they own the mobile home itself. We don't file the renter's credit in the state tax return. We do, even though they get a CRP, the certificate of rent paid for that land, we just do the M1PR, the homeowner's credit, which will account for both. The mobile homeowner must have both the CRP, that's the certificate of rent paid for the land, and the property tax statement. And most mobile home property tax statements come out in June. So whereas property tax statements for single family homes and condos come out in March, mobile homes generally come out in June. A taxpayer may rent the mobile home and rent the lot. So if they're renting both the mobile home and the lot, then we file as the renter. We use the renter credit in the state tax return, the M1, because we'll have CRP. Question in the chat. When will the 2026 property tax statements be available online? Before March? Generally not before March. Each county is a little different. We generally see them around the second week of March, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later. I don't have exact dates for any county, and we will do updates. The tax site managers will do updates at the beginning of each shift. So we'll let you know when the property tax statements are available for any given county. M1PR resources. So look in your manuals or in the M1PR instructions online to find out about various homeowner situations. Page 173. Co-owners and co-occupants in the M1PR. Married taxpayers in Form M1PR. Special property tax refund. And brief guidance on entering in TaxSlayer. Unless you're filing a prior year return, you may not see any property tax refunds until March. You probably will, because people don't always know that they should wait until March if they're a homeowner to do all these tax returns, but you might not. When in doubt, ask for help. Okay, the non-taxable household income. I mentioned this briefly when there's a question about the income limit and whether that was single or married filing jointly, and it doesn't matter because it's not about an individual or a couple, it's about all the adults in the household. So Minnesota household income, this comes into play with the tax return M1PR, the refund of property taxes for homeowners, not for renters, for homeowners. So the refund is based, like we said, on the property tax paid and also on the household income. So the household income is the adjusted gross income plus certain non-taxable income is the Minnesota household income. Taxpayers report non-taxable income on the Prepare and Prosper intake sheet. I'm going to show you that really quickly. Right, not there. Let's see. Right here. Okay, you'll see here in this section of the Prepare and Prosper intake paperwork, we're screening for some forms of household incomes. This is income that is not included in the adjusted gross income calculation for the federal and state tax returns, but we do add it back for purposes of the M1PR. So supplemental security income, state benefits such as MFIP, MSA, GA, or emergency assistance, workers' compensation, scholarship or grants, and then we also ask for any other types of income so we can evaluate whether or not to include that. Non-taxable income sources are only needed for M1PR calculation or listed as a source of income if the rent is greater than the income on the renter's credit. Does not affect the calculation. Non-taxable income sources are only needed for M1PR calculation Okay, sorry, I confused myself for a second. So we used the non-taxable income for the M1PR calculation for homeowners for their property tax refund. We also use it for the renter's credit in the M1 if the rent is greater than the income. It doesn't affect the calculation, but we do need to record that non-taxable household income. Okay, additions and subtractions for Form M1PR. We're back to the homeowner specifically, not the renters. Form M1PR starts with the federal AGI and then adds the non-taxable household income. We just looked at the most common sources of household income that's non-taxable on the Prepare and Prosper intake paperwork. There are some subtractions: 65 or older, persons with a disability, dependents, and retirement amount contributions. So these are added back into this calculation. So the impact of household income. Property tax credits are based on household income. We're talking about both spouse, if the taxpayer is married, both spouses, any other adults in the home who are not dependents. So reporting correct income amounts reduces credits but calculates them correctly. Minnesota Revenue reviews the income reported. So super important that we get this right. Taxpayers may need to repay part of a refund if it's calculated wrong when they file, which means if Minnesota Revenue knows that they're getting some form of non-taxable income and we don't include it, their refund for the property tax might be too high, and then they might come back a year or 2 years later and say, we paid you too much in a refund because you didn't account for this extra income, this household income. Now please pay us back the difference plus the interest, plus this penalty for not doing it right in the first place. Some examples of things that are not household income: non-cash benefits such as SNAP, fuel, child care assistance, child support, Medicaid or medical care, IRA rollovers, life insurance policy payments, property tax refunds, payments from someone else for the taxpayer's medical care, gifts or inheritances, dependents income, non-taxable Holocaust settlement payments, state income tax refunds not reported on a federal tax return. There is more information in the manual, and of course your tax site manager and other volunteers can help you navigate these situations. Public benefits. So cash benefits, like for public benefits such as SSI, GA, MFIP, MSA, are included in household income. So they're not included in the calculation of the adjusted gross income for purposes of calculating the tax liability, but we do add them back to the taxpayer's income for purposes of the M1PR, the property tax refund for homeowners. Benefits from the county may be reported on a verification letter. Taxpayers can request document from a case management team if needed, but not always necessary. Generally speaking, we require documentation of all sources of income, but this is an exception. Generally speaking, if the taxpayer knows the benefit amount, we can report the benefits without the source document. So what should they file? If they lived in a rental for all of 2025, they claim the M1 rent credit on the Minnesota tax return, the M1. If they owned their home on January 2nd, 2026, they filed the M1PR, the property tax refund for homeowners. If they rented in 2025 and then bought a home and lived in it on January 2nd, 2026, they file both. They claim the M1 rent credit on the Minnesota tax return, Form M1, and they file M1PR, the property tax refund for homeowners. They got a CRP from a nursing home, adult foster care provider, assisted living, or other healthcare facility. They claim the M1 rent credit in the Minnesota tax return, Form M1. And if they own their mobile home on January 2nd, 2026, and also paid rent for the lot, they file M1PR, the property tax refund for homeowners, which will encompass both the property taxes they paid for the mobile homes and the rent that they paid for the lot or the land. Okay, wrap up and reminders. Oh, sorry, there was a question here. Okay. Is the North Star Promise considered a tuition waiver for purposes of M1PR? I'm not familiar with that program, so I don't have an answer for you. Sarah, can we check on that and get back to Sandra?
Yep, I'll check.
Thank you. So we'll get back to you, Sandra. Early season IRS refund delays. I hinted at this earlier in the training. So the IRS will begin processing refunds with certain tax credits in mid-February. First to mention, they won't even accept e-filed tax returns until almost the end of January. So for the first few shifts, we're going to hold the tax returns, then have our full-time staff at Prepare and Prosper file those beginning in late January. Tax returns with certain tax credits will be held until mid-February. So federal tax refunds will be delayed if the customer is claiming the earned income tax credit or the additional child tax credit or both. This is an extra measure to prevent against identity theft and fraud. Processing is the same at free and paid tax preparers. So one thing you might hear from customers is they say, well, Liberty or H&R Block or whoever said that they can get me the refund right away with the earned income tax credit. That's not really true. What they're doing in that case is advancing them the refund. The IRS is not processing it any sooner. And then they generally take a portion of that refund when it finally arrives as a fee. So in the end, the customer gets less money overall, a smaller refund, because that paid preparer is taking a portion of the refund and leading them to believe that they're getting it sooner. So it isn't faster at any other preparer. It's the same regardless of who files the tax return on the taxpayer's behalf. The end of shift survey for volunteers. This is an optional shift for volunteers. It's on the links page, and it's a way for you to communicate directly with volunteer resources. Volunteer resources wants to hear your stories and learn how they can better support you. So you have the option at the end of every shift to fill out the survey. Now, you don't have to at the end of every shift, but the more you do it, the better volunteer resources can support you, and the more information volunteer resources and the entire organization can use to better to improve services and processes. So please share training needs and manual edits here, or any other thoughts or feedback you have. We all love to hear from you. So there is an option at the end of each shift to submit that survey. TaxSlayer accounts. Remember, you'll have two TaxSlayer accounts. There's the Practice Lab account, which is what you use to practice and to do the hypothetical tax returns in the certification tests. The Practice Lab accounts is used for practice returns, used to do your certification tests. You created your username and password for the Practice Lab. Remember, Practice Lab is the one that you enter Train Pro Web in all uppercase letters before you enter it. Then there's the TaxSlayer Pro online account. This is the real deal. We use it to prepare real tax returns for real taxpayers. Volunteer resources will send you your login information before your first shift. So remember, the Practice Lab is only for practice, and TaxSlayer Pro online account is for real tax returns. If you volunteer at more than one tax site, you're going to have more than one for TaxSlayer Pro online login, because the logins are specific to each site. When in doubt, ask your tax site manager for assistance. Remember your resources. You have tons of resources. You have managers, reviewers and other volunteers, volunteer checklists, Prepare and Prosper volunteer tax manuals, Publication 4012, which is the IRS publication with really, really, really detailed information about tax situations, even more detailed than Prepare and Prosper's volunteer manual. The customer's intake paperwork, and Prepare and Prosper's volunteer website, which is prepareandprosper.moodlecloud.com. The thing that I want to stress most as a tax site manager is don't be afraid to ask for help. And if you don't understand something, don't feel embarrassed, and don't feel like you're not pulling your weight. The way that you're really going to learn this is by doing it in real life. And whenever you're in doubt, just ask. And if you think you're asking too many questions, you're not. Remember, the majority of the tax site manager's job is to support the volunteers, in addition to making sure the entire process runs correctly, e-filing tax returns, etc. But the most significant portion of our jobs is to support the volunteers, which involves answering questions, even if you think the questions are a lot. So please, please, please just ask, and we'll be very happy to help you. And you also can ask more experienced volunteers who are sitting next to you, especially if there's some downtime. Share your feedback with us. What worked for you? What do you wish we had covered or had spent more time on? You can, if you want to grab your phone right now and use this QR code, you can do that, or you can use the SurveyMonkey link, which we'll also put in the chat. I'm going to change the slide really quick, but I'll come back to this QR code if you haven't scanned it yet. IRS certification tests. Recall that you have 3 tests to pass before you start volunteering. You have the volunteer standards of conduct, the basic or advanced tax test, and the one that, the intake and quality review test. Remember that the first clinics are on January 24th, so please finish your tests before your first shift. If you're not finished with your first shift, if you're not finished with your certification test before your first shift, please contact Volunteer Resources and they'll help you navigate that situation. They might ask you to come to the shift anyway, and you can do your certification tests there at the clinic, at the tax site, or they might ask you to wait and, I don't know, just contact Volunteer Resources. They'll tell you what to do. So take the basic tests or the advanced tests. You don't have to do both, but if you have some tax knowledge, you might consider doing the advanced test and not the basic test. Or if you don't, you can do the basic test, that's fine. I will tell you, I came into this role 10 years ago with no tax knowledge at all. I didn't know the difference between an M1 and an M1PR. And I jumped straight to the advanced test and I passed it on my first time. So if you're feeling like it, you can try the advanced test or you can do the basic test. Or what a lot of volunteers actually do, especially if it's their first year, is they take the basic test now and then they try a few shifts and see how it goes. And then later on, they do the advanced test and move up to the advanced certification later in the tax season. That's also an option. Can you do both? That's a question in the chat. Sure. If you want to, you can do both. I will say, if you start with advanced and you pass the advanced test, there's no point in doing the basic test because it's just an easier version of the advanced test. The only advantage would be that you get more practice. If you start with the basic test and you pass it, and then you want to try the advanced test, sure, go for it. Okay, the test on the Volunteer Standards of Conduct, VSC. This is the ethical code for VITA sites across the US. And here are the major points to remember for this test that they're going to ask you about. We don't solicit any business from taxpayers. Remember, our purpose here is to serve people for tax returns. If they seem like a great client for our business or our spouse's business or any other kind of business that seems like it might be a good fit for them, we don't want to solicit them for any kind of business. So we do referrals. We have a referrals handout that we give customers for situations that we can't help them with, like referrals to a CPA, for example, but we can't solicit any business from taxpayers. We don't accept tips. So if it doesn't happen very often, but occasionally customers want to offer a tip. That is no, 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 no. Never, 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 never any tips. We don't knowingly prepare a return with false information. So if a customer tells us something and then we have documentation from that customer that says something else, we need to clarify. Maybe the customer was misunderstood or just made a mistake in what they said, or they forgot. If they insist that the documentation is wrong, then generally we're going to need to have them correct that documentation before we file the tax return. And I've never actually seen this happen, but if they ask us to enter something that is not accurate or correct, we do not do that. So we don't knowingly prepare a return with false information. The keyword here is knowingly. We need to be diligent to make sure we try our best to find out what is accurate. Sometimes things slip through the cracks that we don't know about, but the keyword here is knowingly. We don't knowingly prepare a return with false information. And we conduct accurate, respectful, and professional work. There's another question in the chat about the basic or advanced certification. Can I try advanced if I didn't pass, then do basic? We're going to talk about what happens if you don't pass the tests in a couple slides from now, so we'll cover that soon. Then we have the test on the intake and interview and quality review. So the most important point about the intake process is that the photo ID and the social security number or ITIN documentation must be viewed. The social security number most commonly comes from the social security card, but there are other acceptable forms of documentation for social security numbers. The interview, the preparer uses the intake paperwork to do a detailed tax interview. Remember, the intake paperwork guides the conversation. And we review everything on the intake paperwork with the customer. And the quality review, even though you're not going to be doing reviews yourself, you should know how the process works. All returns are reviewed by a volunteer who did not prepare the return. I can guarantee that they're going to ask you about this on the test. It is never, ever, ever, ever acceptable for the person who prepares the tax return to be the person who reviews the tax return, which means we need a minimum of 2 volunteers for every tax return, 1 to prepare and 1 to review. The taxpayer is involved in the quality review. And that happens both at checkout when the customer support volunteer goes over the highlights of the tax return. And very often the reviewer is going to find the taxpayer waiting in the waiting area and ask questions for clarification to ensure that the tax law is provided or is applied correctly. So yes, the taxpayer is involved in the quality review. Here are some test tips. There is no time limit. You can start and then stop and return to it the next day, 2 days later, both in the book, the paper copy, and the online version. You can just exit and return to it later. It's open book. Use all of your resources. So use your Prepare and Prosper Volunteer Tax Manual. You can use IRS Publications 4012, 4961, 5101. In my experience, the Prepare and Prosper Volunteer Tax Manual is sufficient for the certification tests. Some people like to double check in the IRS publications, like cross-reference. You can use these training slides, which are on the from this presentation and the other presentations. They're on the Prepare and Prosper training site. To pass any test, you must score 80% or higher. So remember we have the volunteer standards of conduct. You need 80% or higher. The intake/interview and quality review test, you need 80% or higher. And the basic or advanced certification tax test, you need 80% or higher to pass. Now, for each of these 3 tests, you have 2 chances to pass, which means that if you take any one of these tests and you don't pass it your first time, please don't freak out. Take a moment, pause, and contact the Volunteer Resource Department at volunteer@prepareandprosper.org. And the Volunteer Resources Department will help you navigate the best approach. Because remember, if you receive a score of lower than 80% on any one of these tests more than 2 times, then you can't volunteer this year. Now, don't get scared or feel bad if you don't pass a test the first time. It can happen for a variety of reasons. So remember, if you don't pass any one of them for the first time, just contact Volunteer Resources, and Volunteer Resources will help you find the best path forward. So to answer the most recent question in the chat, can I try advanced if I didn't pass, then do the basic? So meaning try advanced and then go to basic if you don't pass advanced. My suggestion is that if you start with advanced and you don't pass the first time, contact Volunteer Resources Department using this email address and ask what the best approach is. Volunteer Resources might advise you to try the advanced test a second time, and then if you don't pass it the second time, then try basic, or they might advise you to go straight to basic. So yeah, your best bet is to contact Volunteer Resources. After you're done with your IRS certification tests, you will email form 13615 to volunteer@prepareandprosper.org. This form proves that you passed the required tests. You can download the form from the testing website. So this is an example of form 13615. Since we have a little bit of time, I'll show you an example of what it looks like filled out. One moment. It's 2 pages. This is just a cover page. It shows your name, that you're a VITA volunteer. It has your address, number of years volunteered, which you fill out, and it shows a letter P for each test that you passed. So in my case, I did the volunteer standards of conduct, which every volunteer, regardless of their role, has to do. I did the intake/interview and quality review test and passed that, and the advanced tax certification test, and I passed that. And I emailed this form to volunteer@prepareandprosper.org. So I just sent an email and said, here it is. And they wrote back and said, thank you. Okay. Important information about the tax certification tests. The IRS materials, which is publication 4012, and the certification tests contain tax law prior to July, before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was passed. So when you're taking your tests, either the basic or advanced certification tests, use the dollar amounts listed in publication 4012. Don't base your answers on the dollar amounts found in the Prepare and Prosper Volunteer Manual, because that has been more recently updated. Also, publication 6744 also has errors on the basic test. Check out the handout on the training site, important information about IRS certification tests. I'm going to show you where to find that right now. So on the Prepare and Prosper Volunteer website, we're going to look for important, nope, not there. Okay, it must be under preparing and reviewing, maybe. Important information about tax certification tests, read first. Right here. So to find that, I went to prepareandprosper.moodlecloud.com. I clicked on preparing and reviewing, and I scrolled down to important information about tax certification tests, read first. And that's this document right here. Again, this gives you test taking tips, including if you don't pass a test, email volunteer resources or email volunteer@prepareandprosper.org to get help before taking it again, because you get only 2 attempts. And okay, where was I? Slides. Attend the practice lab. That's after you finish this training, that you have registered for the practice lab, either online or in person. This is required for new volunteers. It's helpful for returning volunteers. There are several practice test returns. So in the practice test, or in the practice lab, the facilitator will give you hypothetical tax returns that are similar to the tax returns that you're going to see in the certification tests. So it gives you good practice to prepare for both the certification tests and for real customers. And while you're working, there are helpful staff and experienced volunteers available to help you with questions such as why a credit does or doesn't apply, how to navigate TaxSlayer, etc. And if you have enough time during that practice lab, you can start your certification tests. Alrighty, we are at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to go back to that screen with the QR code. Feel free to share your feedback with us. You can use that QR code or that link we do have some time left. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask them right now. Otherwise, you're free to go. And thank you for attending Basic D.